And I came all the way from Canada to tell you a little bit about how you can improve your development processes in different ways. And when we're talking about developing, there's two elements to that, really. The first one is really about building core skills. Where do you get all the resources you need to learn how to develop more effectively and spend less time coding, more time enjoying life? And the second part is really about learning tools and techniques. So what tools and techniques are out there to make you a really killer .NET developer? So we're going to start with the skills aspect. The one thing that is happening, and you'll notice that when you talk to anybody from Microsoft, there's a whole bunch of technologies that are coming out. And one of the hardest elements is really trying to cope with that change, trying to cope with all these technologies you have to learn, trying to figure out what technologies are the ones that you should use within your infrastructure and the ones that make most sense. So if you Moore's Law, every, about 27 months, 28 months, the speed of the CPU is increasing. So what that means is that not only is the CPU increasing, we have multi-core CPUs. So as developers, we have to start learning techniques such as threading to keep up. And there's also a lot of other things you have to consider. For example, now, if you go to any electronics store, you'll find that a lot of the hard drives are much larger. And so you can get a terabyte drive to store all your data. And it's going to become a lot better and much easier to manage data as time goes on. I'll give you another example. When I was a consultant, before I joined Microsoft, I had to build this application on a Pocket PC that used a map infrastructure that used these Pocket PC devices for inspectors at a bank. So essentially, the bank hired me to build this application because they had to track the inspection of different homes, and these inspectors would go in, take photos of the home, and certify that the homes were okay. And what ended up happening was some of the inspectors filled out the forms but didn't actually visit the homes, and the homes had burned down. So essentially, the bank was paying for a house that was no longer there. So they called on me to build an application that used a combination of GPS and cell tower triangulation to provide the accurate coordinates of the specific spot where the inspector was at that given point in time. And the inspector could use a camera and could use a combination of that GPS unit and camera in a form, which can be signed with ink, in order to fill out the form, which would be sent back to the head office. In the head office, they had to implement this really extensive GIS system. So it's a geographical mapping system in order to run the application. And at the time, they paid $10,000 or more for that GIS system. And if you look today, you go online, there's a lot of different mapping technologies out there. There's companies like MapQuest, Google, Live Maps that are out there that provide mapping capabilities for free. And part of that is the whole availability of hardware. So the next thing is, how do you develop those skills? How do you learn about technology and keeping up with technology? And in Canada, and we've identified this broadly, the three elements is community, offline, and online. These are the only three places really where you can learn new skills. So community would be user groups and other gatherings, associations, and societies where you can find out what your peers are doing and really keep a pulse on developing technologies. Offline, these are things like this conference where you're learning about technologies from different experts around the world, and also learning from your peers. And how many of you have contacted or talked to an MVP? Nobody. Okay, one, two hands, three hands. So MVPs are Microsoft Most Valuable Professionals, and these are experts in specific domains that can definitely help you. And typically when you post questions online on the forums, they're the ones who answer the questions along with the product groups. Then finally, we have online, which includes blogs and Facebook. I use Facebook personally to keep in touch with my different contacts, and I have a whole network of people who will support me if I'm having problems with my code or if I have any questions in any given area, because in my role I have to know a lot of different technologies. So how many of you are on Facebook? Okay, feel free to add me as a friend if you wish, okay? You have a contact at Microsoft Canada now. So these three resources are very valuable. And the one resource I can recommend to you right away is the Indian .NET user groups. So there's a .NET user group right here in Bangalore, and they've had a lot of really great presentations. So I would highly recommend that you check out their website, which is listed at the bottom. And if you're not sure, if you live in some different area and you want to really know what community resources are out there, on the Microsoft website, there's a list of all the .NET user groups in all surrounding areas. And you can connect, again, to those MVPs, those experts that can answer your questions. And you can connect to other people who are working in the same industry as you. So very valuable technical information and also connection. So what's a best practice? This is the definition per Wikipedia. So it's an incentive or reward. It's information that's imparted very quickly. And as you know, development can be quite complex. So what I've done is I've summarized the different tips and tricks in little chunks, easily digestible chunks, in order to help you manage your software development process. So the first one we're going to cover is the challenges that you typically encounter. So where do I get architectural guidance? I often get asked the question, how do I effectively build a web application? What is the proper architecture I should take for that web application? And how do I manage my development process? It's really amazing. How many of you have a development process? Okay, a lot of you. That's great. And even those of you who haven't raised your hands, you have a development process. If you store code aside, if you build code, that process of building an application is a process. And the difference between processes is some processes are more mature, some are less mature. And the more mature processes mean that when you're developing your applications or your software, you can most effectively determine the length of time, the estimation of when that software will be deployed, and the quality level of the software that will be deployed. So depending on that maturity level, you can determine that. And I'll be covering some of the processes you can use in case there may be some areas that you may not have explored yet. Then the next one is, how do I properly handle source code? How many of you are using just a repository, just like some file share to store your code? Wow, nobody's using that. In Canada, you get a lot of hands up. How many of you are using Visual Source Safe? See, a lot of you. Okay. How many of you are using another type of version control? Yes, yes? Okay. So it's about half and half between VSS and VSTS and other version control systems. So the way you manage source control, how many of you are afraid of merging and branching? Yeah. I bet most of you were the VSS crowd, right? So essentially, there are best practices on how to do these things. And it's important to know these best practices because it can save you during really critical times when you're working on source control. So how do you manage your non-functional requirements? Can anyone tell me what a non-functional requirement is? Performance, yeah, that's one of them. Security. So, pardon? Scalability, yes. Performance, scalability, security, these kinds of things. And what's really funny is when you're hired to build a software development or project, typically they won't pay you for those elements, right? You can say, well, I'll build this feature, this feature, this feature, but if you say, I will make the application reliable, they'll go, well, I'm expecting that. But yet, you still have to spend time doing it. So how do you mitigate that? How do you find techniques in order to build in that reliability without having to spend more time and perhaps lose favor with your customers? And then you have, how should I approach security? Security is a huge topic. And where do you start? Where is a good place where you can learn how to implement security? And finally, where do you get the skills? And I kind of outlined some of the communities and some of the areas where you can start building skills. So the first part is, how do I build and architect my application? And so I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Team System has a bunch of architecture tools. It has essentially a code modeling tool, which you can view the way your classes and methods are laid out and so forth. It also has an architecture tool where you can build an application architecture and map it to an infrastructure architecture and validate whether your application validates with that infrastructure. So what's really valuable about that is if you're building an application and the infrastructure doesn't support it, then you can find out right away instead of trying to deploy it and then finding out that port 46 is closed on your server and your application relies on port 46. So there's a lot of new advances that are coming into a new version of Team System called Rosario, and I'll be covering that in another session. So if you're interested in that topic, feel free to come into that other session. So one of the ways you can architect your applications is by using some of the best practices that have been established. The first one, or the first set that I call out, is the design patterns gang of 4, and these have been built by the community. And these are a really good source of knowing, how to architect your application in a sound way that's been accepted by the masses. And we also at Microsoft have developed something, different methodologies and different processes. For example, we have patterns and practices as our core set of practices. And the patterns and practices team really came out of a desire and a need of people contacting Microsoft saying, how does Microsoft build applications? What's the best practice that Microsoft recommends? And so we had the Microsoft Consulting Services work with the product teams, work with partners to figure out what exactly was that process. And we published a lot there. So we have the enterprise library, and that implements all the best practices for data, security, and other kinds of management. The guidance automation toolkit allows you to automate the process of developing code. So you can develop recipes that will churn out code automatically. And what's good about that is if you have a best practice within your company and you want to just implement it very quickly and you want it repeatable and you want the developers using the same process every time, the guidance automation toolkit is the way to do it. Then you have domain-specific languages. So how many of you have used the class designer in Visual Studio? Okay. So what's interesting about the class designer is that it'll give you a visual representation of your code. It will give you the bubbles that represent your classes and methods. And what's great is you can make changes to those bubbles and then revert back to code, and it will be reflected in code. So that visualization of models to code to models is domain-specific languages. And the reason we built that is, for example, let's say you're involved in aeronautics or the airline industry. You may have to represent something like a control tower in code, right? The relationship, the endpoint of that control tower. And wouldn't it be nice if you have a design surface and you have this little icon of a control tower that you can just drag onto the design surface, and when you revert back to code, you have all the classes, everything set up, all the patterns you need in order to implement that control tower. So rather than rewrite code, you have a good drag and drop surface so that you can architect your application soundly using the practices that you want and then have it turn out the way you want it. And that's, again, software factory is an incorporation of all these different things. So it's a packaging up of documentation on how your application should be built. It's a packaging up of these different recipes and also domain-specific languages. So if you don't have a process in place, or if you have a partial process in place and you go, you know what, I'd really like to improve my build process, or I would like to improve the way I do testing, and I don't have an established test framework. So where can I get some information on how to improve those processes? The Microsoft Solutions Framework is not a process. It's a framework to help you build a process. So we provide you with all the different best practices in these different areas of architecture, program management or project management, development, testing, and so forth. So if there is a gap in the way you manage your process, you can take the MSF as a good starting point in knowing how to implement it. And there's two different process templates that are available in Team System. The first one is an Agile process template, which uses some of the principles of Agile in order to implement a process. And then you have Cmmi. And how many of you are using a Cmmi process? Okay, a good number, and I'm not surprised. So Cmmi is called the Capability Maturity, the Carnegie Mellon, I forget the exact acronym, sorry about that. But it's used by the Defense Department, by many companies in order to essentially ascertain the maturity level of a specific company. And MSF will allow you to do that. And finally, you have the Microsoft Operations Framework, which provides some best practices based on ITIL, which will essentially map out really nicely to MSF and provide you with how to deploy servers, how to maintain them, how to secure them, and so forth. So all those kinds of best practices. So what I'd like to do is to give you a little demo of what's incorporated within the Microsoft Solutions Framework. And if you're going to attend my session later this afternoon, I'm going to show you how you can modify the framework and customize it to make it work within your specific best practices and how to build them in. So I'm going to get out of my slides and move into the MSF framework. So you can download MSF directly from the Microsoft website. All you need to do is go to www.microsoft.com/MSF, and you can download these templates and really get a sense of what's available in them. So on the first page, it just gives you these high-level concepts. And where it's really valuable is when you start drilling down into different aspects of it. So let's say you're a brand new developer, or you're trying to help a brand new developer to know what that developer is supposed to be doing within the company. So let's say I'm a developer, and I am a developer, so I'll click on roles, and you'll notice that we have a whole bunch of different roles that are available, including business analyst, project manager, architect, and developer. So I'm going to click on developer. And what the developer will provide me is a whole bunch of different work streams. So you'll notice that I have work streams including implementing a development task. So this is developer's bread and butter. You're essentially building a feature, or you're building a task towards building a feature. Then fixing bugs. That, again, is bread and butter for a developer, and building a product. So these are pretty generic. But what if you have very specific needs in terms of each of these steps? What if you want the developer to follow these steps step by step? What I can do is click on here, and what it will do is provide me with the step-by-step of how to implement a development task. It'll provide me with the appropriate work items that I would need in order to implement that task, and also the set of the templates and examples which will provide me with clarity as a new developer in how to implement it. So what I can do is click here on Implement a Development Task, and then it'll have a set of activities. And I'll show you that the first activity is to cost a development task. And the thing is, this may not be appropriate for most developers. If you're not responsible, if you're not the top developer or the lead developer, you may not have to cost that. So what's really cool about MSF is there's a bunch of tools which will allow you to customize MSF. So use the same infrastructure, use the same website structure in order to write all the documentation for your process, but put it in an easy-to-access web format. So what's really great about this is if you're using development tools and you want to integrate process, the process is no longer a binder you put on some bookshelf. The process becomes a part of the development the iterations, the writing of the code, and so forth. So as you can see, I can take a look at it from an activities perspective and even go drill down to the sub-activities in refining these different steps. And what's really cool too is I can click on specific work items and then see, if I click on tasks, take a look at the overview of the task. What exactly is a task? Well, it's the amount of work that you're doing on a specific project. And I can click here on states and transitions. And if you're doing work, there are very specific states that you can have. It's either active or it's closed. If it's active, that means you haven't done the work yet. And if it's closed, that means you've done the work, right? So it's very binary. But there are conditions which may cause you to make it active again. So if the arrows are pointing the wrong way. That's amazing. Anyways, if the task is closed and the feature's been cut or completed or so forth, then it becomes active again. And if you use the work items within Team System, you'll notice that these states and transitions are available right through the product. And what I can do here is to click on the different activities, and you'll notice here that I have the task is applicable to multiple roles. And I could take a look at that specific work item and say, well, a project manager may want to use a task to divide scenarios and to divide the quality of service requirements or the non-functional requirements within a project. And an architect would develop a performance model or perhaps a security model around the application. And a developer would integrate code changes and cost out a development task or do some other things. So as you can see, it's very easy to navigate through these. And you could also take a look at it in terms of different views. So if you take an iterative approach to development, you can take a look at it from the point that you're constantly checking in code, your daily builds are triggering constantly, you have accepted builds, and these drive the iterations of your project, which finally drive the cogs of your project. So you can see each one of these little cogs moving the larger cog, and this highly iterative process is one way that you can assure quality within your software development. So that gives you kind of an overview of what MSF looks like. And like I said, it's highly customizable. And if you go back here, and I'll move back for a second. If you purchase this book, you can get a very good, concise overview of all the different aspects of MSF. So the next question I get is, how do I manage my source code? It becomes very complex to do so. The one thing we've done is we've provided some guidance through Team System on how to merge, branch, how to organize the different branches of your version control in a way that will become manageable and scalable. And the people who've written this guidance have managed large projects like the Windows operating system, which as you can imagine, has several lines of code. So if you want to get some high-level guidance, there's some really good information in this book, Code Complete, and also within this white paper that you can download and view. The next thing is, how do I manage my requirements? So there's a couple of tools that are out there, and I'll give you a demo of how you can build your own requirements to put into Visual Studio very shortly. But essentially, there's a code analysis tool. And what you can do within Team System is plug in the code analysis tool within the build process, within the check-in process, and essentially figure out whether the code meets up with those non-functional requirements. So is the code reliable? Is there any issues with the code? I'll give you an example when I used to work as a consultant. When I was a consultant, there was a problem with the company I worked with where there's a developer that left the company, and the rest of the developers had to reverse engineer some code that developer had written, and there was absolutely no documentation. So they actually spent 2 weeks trying to figure out what the code did and document the code. So the project manager came up to me and said, is there a way that we can verify that whenever a new developer or any developer writes code that they implement, comments. And essentially I said, yes, there is. To build a code analysis rule which will check for comments as you're checking in the code. And if those comments are not in there, it will not permit the developer to check in the code. And so I implemented this, and this solved the problem really nicely. And so you don't necessarily need to use the ones that are built out of the box. You can build your own code analysis rules, your own constraints within your development process. And in the extensibility talk, I'll actually show you some source code and how you would actually go about implementing. So the next is securing the application. And this is a very complex topic. And the best place to start really is the OSI model. So who knows what the OSI model is? Okay, not many hands. So I highly recommend you look up the OSI model. It essentially defines an application in 7 layers. And you have layers like the network layer, the application layer. And by looking at these different layers, you'll know precisely where to secure your application and where there could be possibly threats within your application. There's also a tool that we released called the Threat Analysis and Modeling tool. How many of you have heard of this tool? A couple. So this tool is amazing because you can do a full architecture of your tool, of your application, and do a threat analysis on your application without even writing a single line of code. And the second thing that's really cool about this tool is it's free. And the third thing that's really cool about this tool is once you've done that whole security assessment, you can produce a report that looks very nice. The report will provide you with the best practices on how to fix these different issues, these different threats that have emerged. And finally, you can input all of the results into Team Foundation Server as threats or as tasks or a work item that you'd like to qualify, and then work on them within your project. So you can fully integrate security within your project. So what I'll do is I'm going to give you a demo of this threat analysis and modeling tool. So I'll open it up, and specifically what I'm going to do is I'm going to open an existing threat model, which is the iBuySpy application. So the one really great thing about this threat modeling tool is that it's all-inclusive. You can incorporate the feedback from the highest business analyst right down to the developer, right down to security experts that provide the guidance that you would want to implement within your company. So the first thing you do is you define a general business objective. And so you'll notice here that we have a tree, and I've defined a business objective of increasing the business temperature. In other words, increasing the amount of business that's being generated. And as a business objective, it's increased the business tempo by providing around-the-clock availability of merchandise and reducing the costs associated with brick and mortar presence. Now, this isn't something that a developer would write. Are you agreeing with this? Yes, absolutely. But you could still include this, and this will be rolled into the report. And you'll notice here that if I click on reports, you get a whole variety of reports, including the risk owner, the design team report, development report, task operations, and a whole comprehensive report. Plus, you could create your own custom reports. So where you come in as developers is actually decomposing the application. So this is where the architects, the infrastructure, and developers come in. So first you define the different roles in your application. So you'll notice here that you have the unregistered user. So iBuySpy is a website. An unregistered user would be perhaps an anonymous user trying to access the website. Then you have the registered user. This might be a customer that's already accessed the website, purchased some product from iBuySpy. And then the next one would be administrators. And this would be you as a developer administrating the website. I've also defined here some service roles. So you'll notice we have website role, web service role, and database role. So whenever you roll out any kind of service on the web, there are service running behind the scenes, and you'll notice that the service include the network service. If I click on admin, you'll notice here that the user role is admin, and it uses a very specific authentication mechanism. So I'm using Windows integrated authentication to authenticate my admins. And there are only 1 to 5 administrators on my project. And this is very important because the more users have high elevated credentials, the more likely that the application will be vulnerable. So you notice here that I have a registered user, and instead of using the Windows authentication, it uses the Forms authentication. And you'll notice that here, there's a greater number, 10,000. And if we click here on unregistered users, you'll notice that the authentication mechanism is anonymous. So you'll notice here that under website role, we have network service. Under web service role, we have network service, and we have the system service for the database role. The next component that's really important is your data. So what kind of data do you have within your application? So I defined here 5 different data sources. I have my customer accounts, customer credit cards, product information, orders, and logs. And if I click on customer accounts, I can define the name and description of what that is. The data elements, so for example, the data elements could be the different fields or tables that are in use within that specific structure. And I can classify the data. So for example, a high risk data would be something like credit card numbers. Low risk data would be something like perhaps news on the site. If you lose credit card numbers or it becomes breached, then obviously you are going to be in hot water, a lot more than if you lose some data pertaining to the current news and events. So if you take a look at customer account data, it's very high impact. If you click on customer credit cards, it's high impact. And if I scroll down here and we take a look at the access control, you'll notice it defines for each one of the roles the different CRUD, which stands for create, read, update, and delete permissions for each one of the different data sources. If I click on product information, if we lose the product information, it will have a lower business impact than the credit card numbers. So after you've defined your data, then you define your components. And this is where you come in as developers. So this application has very specific components. It has a website, an administrative web service, database administrative client, and a log store. It provides you with a link to that knowledge base article. And if you write your own threads, you can make connections to your intranet or to your SharePoint site or to whatever you're using internally in order to point out to the best practice of what you'd like to do from a security perspective and from a coding perspective. And then finally, the last thing is if you click on Tools and Visual Studio, you'll notice that it allows me to take a deployment report within Visual Studio, import it into here, run a threat analysis, and then I can export all the work items relating to that threat analysis. So if you haven't tried out this tool, I highly recommend it. It's a good way to kickstart a security process, to write a security report on your application, and to start thinking about security holistically across your application without even touching any code. So what do you guys think of this tool? Good? Yes? Okay. So one of the biggest issues is the barriers to quality. How can we ensure that our applications are more high quality? And if an application is not of high quality, if there's a lot of bugs in the application, the further along you are in the development process, the more likely that you will be encountering bugs and having to pay for them. And the cost of bugs as the development process continues increases dramatically as time goes on. So to improve code quality, you could take an approach called test-driven development. How many of you use unit testing within your development? Wow, that's great. In Canada, unfortunately, we don't have as many hands raised. So unit testing is a very core piece in determining the quality of your code. And I'll give you a little walkthrough of what unit testing looks like in team systems. So unit testing can provide precise data right away to let you know whether your code is essentially following if the data that's coming out of your code is appropriate, to test the values that are passed within your application and so forth. So here's a little demo, a little walkthrough of how you would implement unit testing. And many of you may already know some of this. How many of you have explored code complexity? Aha, okay. One gentleman up there, and I believe he's Canadian. So here's a scenario. You can go into any piece of C# code, right-click, and since most of you raise your hands, you can just right-click and select Create Unit Test. And this will provide you with the ability to create unit tests based on that code without having to write unit tests. Now, typically, when you want to implement test-driven development, the goal is to write the test before you write the code. The goal is to determine what the specifications of your application are before you implement. So what you can do is click and create unit tests, and then you can, it'll create a whole bunch of different test stubs and test methods, and you can implement those to test. For example, if you want a username and password to be passed through, you may want to make sure that the values that are passed through as parameters, it includes an uppercase character, maybe a non-alphanumeric character, and so forth. So once you've defined your different tests, you can run the tests, and in Team System, what it'll do is run through different test results. So the test results are very useful in just telling you whether new code that you've written against this application follows still the same standards that you followed initially, or the premises that you've inferred initially. But what you can do now is look at coverage data. How many of you have used coverage, code coverage? Okay. Code coverage is very useful because it will automatically tell you what code has been tested and what code hasn't been tested. And this is very important because if your unit tests aren't covering specific lines of code, you know what that means? Can anyone tell me? Your application isn't tested completely. And if you take a look at this specific example, you'll notice that if I go down here on get accounts, I have 80% code coverage. But if I go down to get account history, what kind of code coverage do I have? 0. So perhaps I should create some unit tests to test out that code coverage, or to test out that specific functionality, right? So the code coverage provides you with a lot of value from that perspective. So if I move on, what's really useful in Team System and in Visual Studio is it'll provide you with a visual guide as to what code is covered and what isn't. So the code in red would indicate that the code hasn't been covered, and other colors would indicate that it has been covered. Then what you can do is click on Code Metrics and Generate for Solution, and it'll provide you with other types of information which are very useful. So code complexity looks at the amount of code that you're generating, how many times you're inheriting code, and these different factors in order to tell you whether a simplification of code is required. And if you go to Donald Belcham's presentation, he's up there with the laptop with his hand up, he'll talk about refactoring and how you can refactor your application to make it simpler and to make it more effective and more higher quality in essence. So here, if we take a look at get account history, you'll notice that the maintainability index is 45, So it's not that maintainable. It's only halfway maintainable if we count it from a measure of 1 to 100. The cyclomatic complexity is 6, but you'll notice here that we have certain methods here, for example, in certain namespaces where cyclomatic complexity is very high. So we'd have to take a look at that and what is causing the high cyclomatic complexity. And if we take a look here, you'll notice that the value here is 231 lines of code. So in essence, the lines of code is what's causing the cyclomatic complexity. So if you're using Visual Studio 2008, you can get these code metrics and get an analysis of knowing what your application looks like just in terms of a complexity level. Another thing that you can do is look at a call tree and look at the different examples of where you have samples of your application and where the samples are inclusive and exclusive. Another way you can increase the quality of your application is through code analysis and through profiling. So this is what the process looks like from a team system perspective, where you can try to check in your code. And if your code doesn't check in, what happens? You get this window popping up that says, unfortunately, there'll be a policy warning. So you'll notice here that there's a little icon for policy warning. This is where the warnings will pop up. So Team System will also provide some database support in order to provide you with better management of your database. And what's really cool about Team Edition for database professionals is that you can run tests against your database. And you can even run unit tests against your database to make sure that your database is written properly. So the last part I'd like to cover is build. By incorporating a continuous build process within your environment, it's one of the best practices in order to ensure that your code will run well and with fewer bugs. So what I'll do is you set up build verification tests to determine whether a build is ready and whether source code is ready to be branched into a different part of the tree. And build verification tests could also determine whether some source code is ready to be released from that perspective. So here's how we would work within Team Foundation build within Visual Studio 2018 Suite. So the first thing you do is you click on Tools and Options, and you'll notice here that we have very specific options under source control. And the option we've checked off is that it will get latest of items on checkout. So whenever you check out your code, it'll pull out the latest code. So why would you want to do this? Can anyone tell me? So I believe you answered it correctly, and I think you're correct too. Essentially, somebody else might have worked on a code, and you'd want to combine the two and look for conflicts and merge the code where appropriate. So essentially, after you do that, what you can do is click and set up a new build definition. So in building a definition, you can essentially implement continuous integration. So whenever anybody checks in code, it will do that verifying of whether the code, the most recent code, is on your computer or on the server. And here we can create policies to figure out how the build should be retained. So if the build failed, you know what? Maybe I don't want a copy of that build. And you can set all of these policies here. Then you can set the triggers. So if you use Team System in 2005, you had to manually set up some line commands in order to set up this continuous integration. In 2008, it's built in. And all you need to do is click on build on each check-in, and it will continuously build your application. So once you do the check-in, what will happen is it will trigger that build, and then you will get the end result. So the final part really is making your work transparent. So when a code's checked in and so forth, you can use reporting and you can use work items in order to get that traceability across your entire process. So the key thing here and the key points I want to leave with you is that in order to build your skills and so forth, one of the best resources you have is your local community, and you should reach out to them. That tools like books, Msf, and the threat modeling tool are a really good place to look at these different aspects. And that test-driven development and a good build infrastructure will help you in your process. So I'll take about 10 questions, and the best question will get a free copy of Visual Studio 2008 Pro, not for resale. So send me your best questions right away. And by the way, here's my email address. Here's my blog address. If you have any questions, if you want to contact me, if you want to add me on Facebook, please feel free to add me on the list. So does anybody have any questions relating to this topic? Nobody? Well, in this case.
You were talking about threat modeling, right?
Yes.
Threat analysis, threat modeling. So is there any way that you can actually export the system that I'm developing? Is there any way that I can directly import the basic definitions so that I don't need to manually configure all this stuff?
So the question was, in terms of threat modeling, do I need to go through the threat modeling tool and manually configure, or is there a way of doing it in team system so I don't have to go through all these steps? And the answer is yes, partially. So by building the architecture, the application architecture and the infrastructure architecture, and creating that deployment report, it will provide a lot of the information as of what version of .NET's being used and some of the different component attributes and so forth, in order to build out that application model. So you will not have to write it out or configure it manually within the tool. You can import it in, and it will provide you with most of the information.
Where do you think what state of development should
So the second question was, in what state of development should you use this tool? And ideally, it would be at the beginning of your project, but even as you're running through your project, you may want to use the tool just to give yourself a, just essentially to determine, give you a sanity check of whether your application is secure or not, and your assumptions about the security of the application. Any other questions? Yes. Okay, so you were saying that by the time the test team writes their tests, what hasn't been implemented yet? The C# code hasn't been written yet. So how do you map your unit tasks to the maturity of your use cases as it relates to your coding? Correct. Okay, so how do you map your test case to your tasks within the development process? In Visual Studio 2005 team system and Visual Studio 2008 team system, that was more difficult. In Rosario, the new version, there's a test case manager, which will allow you to do that mapping and to essentially even run things like manual tests in an automated way to provide you a better way of managing that. Yes?
Is it known whether VSCS supports all development models?
So does VSCS support all development models? Can you give me an example of what you consider a development model? Yes. So VSTS supports a great number of different development models, including Scrum, extreme programming, different agile processes that you'd want to use. Also, some more formalized processes. For example, there's Sarbanes-Oxley related process, which will allow you to write to the constraints that are set out by the American government. There's Cmmi, as I explained before, and many others. The great thing, too, is that you can customize the process to whatever process you need to implement. So in Java, there's tools like so JUnit and okay, JMock. Okay, so his question was in Java, there's tools like JMock. Is there something similar in Team System? Currently, no. You can use, there's a lot of mock frameworks for .NET, including Rhino mocks that you can use to implement currently within the tool, and it will integrate with Team System as the code's being generated. You can also check it in and so forth, implement it within the process. So I'll take 2 more questions, then I'll figure out who's the winner. Yes? So does VSTS allow you to map your test cases to your requirements? And the answer is yes. You can map your test cases to your requirements by setting out test case work items, and then essentially your requirements and the test case would tie into the specific test that you're running, the series of tests. And then, yes?
Why is this unit testing more integrated with VSTS and not just solutions to the developer?
Aha.
Not using VSTS.
Why is unit testing more deeply integrated in Team System and not in Visual Studio? Well, in 2005, you're right. The unit testing was not integrated in Team System, in Visual Studio. In 2008, we've incorporated unit testing in the professional version of Visual Studio 2008. So even if you're not using VSTS, you can use the unit test framework. And you know what? That's an awesome question. You've won the copy of Visual Studio 2008 with unit testing. So thank you, everybody, for coming to my session. And if you want to learn more about Team System, especially the next session will be very much focused on the future. And I have a lot of demos to show you and some really cool new functionality. And the main thing about the new version of Team System is that there hasn't been very many presentations made on it. So you're getting some very new content. Thank you.